So let's start by settling the body and establishing positive motivation. Just getting comfortable, going inward, and setting that positive intention. Generating those minds of confidence in the path that the Buddha set forth, the path transmitted to us over thousands of years, the path that is still practiced, still understood. The path that reliably, repeatably transforms ordinary mind into enlightened mind. And the motivation for practicing that path being to become of limitless benefit to sentient beings. So we generate these minds of refuge and bodhicitta. All right. Does anyone have a question from last class? Nope. So we're still on the general section of this chapter where Lama Zopa was going through the 9-point death meditation, the individual contemplations that comprise the 9-point death meditation in more detail, so that we have more to draw on. And we finished those first two so far, the contemplations associated with the certainty of death and those associated with the uncertainty of the time of death. And the third major contemplation is that at the time of death, it is only our spiritual practice that is of any benefit. And that is what we're starting now, the next series of contemplations. And so we're on day 106. And this section only goes, I believe, to day 113. So we may have two more, including today. There may be two more classes, or we may finish today. I don't know, but maybe one more. But we're definitely getting to the end of this chapter on the Lamrim, on death and impermanence. So the first, I'm sorry, we're actually on day 107. I was going to maybe recap day 106 where we left off. That was the last thing that we covered, where Lama Zopa was putting, everything into context by reiterating the fact that this topic, the purpose of this topic, is to help us to reorient ourselves, to reflect on this topic again and again, so that we find it easier to turn toward our practice and turn away from distraction. He says that that wisdom fear is a wake-up call. And so, it's important to keep in mind that we're not being morbid, we're not being depressing, we're trying to give ourselves the fuel that we need to move away from kind of the meaningless, what Lama Zopa often refers to as the meaningless affairs of this life, and turn toward something of great meaning, which is our practice. So then in day 107, we begin understanding the last contemplation, that it's only our practice that is of any benefit at the time of death. And so the quotation is, we can't take even one strand of hair or one grain of rice into the next life. And it might be this idea of the strand of hair is interesting, because it could be that there's an analogy that they give where they talk about that apparently, I haven't demonstrated this because I don't have any yak butter on hand, but they say that, death is like a single strand of hair being pulled from a block of yak butter. They claim that there's nothing, no residue, on the hair. It just sort of cleanly uh, can be extracted. So I don't know, if you find any yak butter and you want to pull out a strand of hair, let me know how it goes. We can validate that. And it's just sort of an analogy, so not so important, but maybe that's what he's getting at when he says, that it's like that we can't even take a strand of hair. Also true that the hair on our head doesn't come with us. Also a valid point. So he might be saying that too. But really he's talking about, of course, predominantly our possessions. But it is the case that in this contemplation, they do talk about the body, this thing that that we spend our whole lives caring for and washing and hair, giving ourselves the stylish, kinds of haircuts and looking after. And of course, in a reasonable way, we need to continue to do that. We need to, make sure that we're extending, that we're maximizing our lifespan by not abusing the body and by being reasonable about how we regard it. But still, it is true that at the time of death, our body doesn't come with us. So the mind leaves the body like a strand of hair being pulled from yak butter, and there's nothing that remains of the physical body at the time of death. The mind remains, of course, but there's nothing of the physical form that remains at that time. And then, of course, in addition to the body, all of the things that we've accumulated, all of our our fancy electronics and whatever else, cars that we spent a lot on, our house, none of that is able to come with us. And that's also something, just like the physical body, we've spent a lifetime getting wrapped up in, blemishes that appear on the body, changes in our hair, wrinkles. We get wrapped up in all of that. And we also get wrapped up in accumulating things. And none of that ends up mattering at that moment. And in fact, all of that energy and the actions that we engage in under the influence of that energy, those can be real obstacles at the time of death. Because even if we recognize that everything that we label as ours at that moment will take on the label of being someone else's, that in and of itself might cause some distress, to the mind. because they're like, oh, are they going to take care of it in the same way that I did? Are they going to, because if we have this habit of, polishing our car every Sunday, and and we think we're worried, like, oh, is my significant other or my children, are they going to look after it in the same way? So it's important to think about those habits, those tendencies in the mind, and can we be at ease with, maybe that's true, maybe we are the only one that cares about our collection of records or books or figurines, or maybe our friends, our family, maybe it's not their hobby, they aren't going to, maybe they are going to sell it, to a stranger at the time of our death. And are we okay with that? Can we get to a point where that doesn't bother us? That's not going to be an obstacle at the time of death, that these things may go to a complete stranger who doesn't think about them in the same way, doesn't care about them in the same way. Or at the time of death, is there going to be that anxiety? Are we going to worry about that? And is that worry, the arising of that anxiety, could that trigger a not so great karmic seed at the time of death that we would otherwise prefer to avoid triggering? Because what Lama Zopa is saying is that it is our practice to deal with these energies. That is our practice, and we're not powerless. We have the ability to get to a point where that anxiety won't arise, and that is what we're meant to be working on. That's what our job is to use the time that we have to get to a point where that isn't going to happen, and someone else can't do that for us. No one else is going to do that for us, and we have the capacity to accomplish that if we try. So that's part of what our practice entails, is taking responsibility for what we're attached to and what causes us anxiety, and overcoming that energy in the mind, so that we have confidence that when that time comes, we will be at peace. That those things, and then here it's not. We'll get to other things, like other things that we have to leave, but like people, but that just doesn't come up quite yet. Here it's more materialistic than that. Um, he says, how much work has been involved in obtaining our possessions. Think of all of the years studying and working, earning more and more to buy more and more. Think of all the negative actions carried out while acquiring these things, all the anger, the desire, the jealousy, and so forth. Yet when we die, all these things we've acquired over our lifetime will be left behind without choice. The only thing we will take with us is the negative karma we created in obtaining our possessions. So that's also, the process, the act of engaging in the accumulation is also something, that's also an ongoing process. It isn't just, oh, I should indulge from now on. Yeah, Kodo. Did you have?
Please finish. Well, I do have a question, but I not immediately. I mean, when you're finished.
So he's just saying, it isn't that we ought to continue to go down the path. We maybe up until now or up until recently, there's been a path of this accumulation, Um, and but he's saying that we shouldn't just keep doing that and then also think about, oh, in 20 years or 30 years, there will have been yet more accumulation, and I should think about being unattached at at the time of death, but that we also have to look at the process of accumulation itself, because is it true that that process comes along with mental actions that are sowing seeds that are not the kinds of seeds that we want to leave in the mind? Is it true that that action itself is creating tendencies and habits that we don't really want in the mind, um, ra- rather than only thinking about it in terms of, well, sure, I'll continue to engage in all of this accumulation, and then all of the things I'm surrounded with, I'll try to think about how to let go of. It's a dual process, because even if we don't really spend a lot of time and energy over indulging in the process of accumulation, still there will be things that we do possess, that we cherish, you know, that we're attached to, unavoidably. We're almost certainly not going to live in a cave. Um, we're going to have things, and we're going to have emotional reactions and attachments to those things, irrespective of how much we indulge in that process. So, but it's a two-pronged thing. We need to become aware of both aspects. Uh, yeah, that's what I was going to say.
So now I'll ask my question. So I understand that we take our worries or our freaking out or our negative karmas that we have not purified or processed when we pass, but don't we also take our virtues and even the tiniest little aspiring bodhicitta or awareness of the big
Yeah,
thing with us too?
yeah, it's just
Thank
not
you.
practical, to always make that counterpoint. He right now, all he's doing, he's just giving us something to be concerned about. He could always, give a counterpoint to that, but then it would just take a long time. So that's just kind of what he's doing. Um, but yeah, but the negative karma here again, it isn't the negative karma of the anxiety. That is one thing. But he's also saying the negative karma that we created 20 years ago when we accumulated the thing that, because we coveted, our neighbor, they got a new car, and so then we started thinking, oh, I need to also get a new car to keep up with appearances. And he's saying even that, which happened 20 years ago, and maybe we've had that car now for 20 years. So there's two aspects to it. One is that back 20 years ago, there was this not so great karmic process that we indulged in, and now there's a separate, not so great karmic process that we're indulging in, where we're relating to the thing that we have in an overly exaggerated way, that is going, that then will cause us to grasp and cling at the time of death. So we did kind of two things that were problematic. We were motivated to engage in the active accumulation based on a tendency or a habit that's problematic. And then once we did the accumulating, we continued to relate to what was accumulated in a way that's not so great. And that initial tendency of being motivated to accumulate, that probably won't be what is super active, at the time of death. But it's still going, that will be more so the separation from the object, but still we laid a separate, maybe not as active seed in the mind that, you know, is still present and not so, not so ideal. Any other questions? Yeah, Aaron.
So we do practice like Vajrasattva to purify ourselves. How do they play it in this whole picture? Because we're supposed to hold, for example, that it does really purify us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he's so it depends with Vajrasattva. Generally what we're more so focused on. So in a way, it depends on what we're choosing to focus on with Vajrasattva. The main thing that we choose to focus on are like more overtly unethical actions, like lying, stealing, killing, things that harm others for the most part. Um, and then we have to keep in mind that we have the power of restraint, that we're meant to be working with as part of that. So if because the karmas that he's talking about here, they're a bit more subtle. No one really, if we become someone who travels the world, going to wine shows and hunting down vintages of wine and accumulating a vast wine cellar, that doesn't hurt anyone. There's nothing unethical about that. It might be, but separately from ethics, Buddhism would talk about that as being kind of a silly waste of time. And it might crowd out time and space for more important things. And it may set up patterns and tendencies and habits that are obstacles. But it's not unethical. If it's our money and we're not lying to anyone, it's just kind of silly. So, but it's still important to think about. So if that's probably for that person, they may be a Buddhist, and they may be concerned about not lying to people, not killing people or insects or animals, or engaging in sexual misconduct, and yet they might be spending a lot of time and energy and effort energizing things that are not so useful. And therefore, they may not be choosing to include that. They would have to be employing some degree of the remedy of restraint, meaning they're making an effort to not do that again in the future. So it may not, it could for a lot of people not fall under the categories of things that they're looking at as being subject to purification. And maybe that's relatively valid, because it's not an ethical issue. Yeah, I think it could fall under a different category of concern. Yeah, Coda.
So pertaining to ethics, it's a very fine line sometimes. If we're buying, now I'm in Santa Fe, it's winter, and if I'm buying flowers from wherever, they've been either grown in California or someplace in the South. And if they're in California, they're probably not grown organically. So they're grown by spraying a lot of chemicals. And those chemicals are so nasty for our environment and the farm workers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why I don't put flowers on my altar, because they are not ethically sourced. And I'm an environmental science teacher. So when you track back to where the source of the thing that you're offering or buying or eating is, it's most of the food or stuff in this country is completely unethical. And so even though I didn't spray the chemicals and I didn't hurt the farmers and I didn't kill the bees, I'm still supporting a company that does. So I personally choose to not participate as best I can out of ethics. But sometimes people just think, oh, I just have to go grab a bouquet of $8 flowers from a cheap Trader Joe's to put on the altar, but they're full of chemicals. So I don't know. I have a real.
Yeah, I mean, the world is a messy place. That's certainly true. And so we should certainly try to do, as you're saying, we should try to do our best. But, at the same time, what if the company that is, doing a good job, what if they're owned by a multinational conglomerate that, owns other things, and they're taking a share of the profits from the company that's, it really depends on how far you want to try to track things back. I mean, with offerings, we're trying to make a connection with enlightened mind, enlightened energy, that even though the source of it in some way might have a contaminated, basis, the karma of it for our mind could still serve as a cause and condition for our enlightenment. And the world is always going to be a broken place. That's what samsara is. Samsara is broken. And so if a contaminated thing creates the causes and conditions for a particular sentient being to achieve enlightenment, enlightened beings are what the universe or reality really needs. So can you transform something? Regardless of what it is, we're still, transforming it, with pure view, pure appearance. It's still a contaminated thing that's being transformed into a pure offering, regardless of how careful we are or not careful we are. Either way, it's still a contaminated thing being transformed into a pure offering from our side. So I don't disagree that people should try to do the best they can, but if that is but I wonder if there's a false dichotomy that's created then between, well, this is ethical or this isn't ethical, when if we have a clear, if there is a gradation that's clear, and we have the means and the opportunity, then yeah, that's wonderful to be able to layer on top, making a better choice. But I just don't know that there's a real option that truly exists, outside in the world. And then if that person, on the basis of that, is saying, I just won't make any offerings of any kind ever, maybe that there's a consequence to that too. Um, but offerings, it's also true that offering is primarily a mental karma. And so we can offer things just by thinking about it. We can offer the flowers that we observe in nature. Um, so, there's a variety of different things that are involved in that. Aaron, you have a question?
I was going to say that I always kind of saw it like, I'm sorry, my dogs are freaking. That it's more like skillful actions and unskillful aren't necessarily ethical because they're more about training one's character. And some actions might be neutral. They might not have any ethical valence to me or you, but for other people, they actually make them a worse person because of the nature of their overall dispositions and character traits.
Do you have a specific way in which you work with that? Like a
I think the best example is like hanging out with certain friends. Like there's certain cases where if I'm around certain people, I act differently. And it's not something I intentionally do. I just lack the self-control to act certain ways around them. Like I'll like spend more money, I'll be more rude, things like that. And in many ways, like it's not like I'm doing anything bad exactly. There's no ethical harm to me or them or anyone else, but it's unskillful. And I think we could apply that also to certain scenarios where like the actions might be ethically bad or not the best, not optimal. You know, we might think in like utilitarian or other ethical theory terms, but they are skillful given what we have, because that's the best we can do.
yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Venerable, this isn't a question, but just as a kind of a sidebar. When my dad lived with us for about 10 years, and the last couple of weeks of his life, we were with him as he was dying. And when we went to pull together all the things that he'd accumulated in his 94 years of living, we had 3 cardboard boxes full of his stuff. And we always remind ourselves what a great example that was just in life. And, you know, I mean, there are times in your lives where you accumulate, raising a family, etc. And then there are times, and I think as we grow older, we have a little bit of grace there because we need less and less and less. So anyway, I was just giving you a nice story.
Okay. Okay, so now in the next one, like I said, we have to also address people that because when we die, there are relationships that we've also established with friends, with family, loved ones, etc. And those people are going to remain and we are not. So this is also something that's part of our practice, getting in the same way, getting comfortable with that too, getting comfortable with the fact that we can have attachment to people that is different than love for people. And because love in Buddhism is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And attachment is a clinging, is a neediness, is the view that it isn't that I want, you know, when it's active, it isn't that I'm focused on wanting that person to be happy. You may also feel that way, but when it is active, that's not the lens that is being used. The lens that's being used when that energy is active is the lens of, I want that person to make me happy. I want that person in my life, in my experience, because being in their presence, being close to them is comfortable. They agree with me. They say the same things. They mirror my worldview. They have the same, broadly speaking, some of the same interests, the same desires. Um, and so I find it easy, I find it not confronting, not difficult to engage them in conversation, to be around them. It's pleasing to the mind, and we enjoy things that are pleasing to the mind, and we don't want to be separated from experiences that are pleasing to the mind. And so we want that people like that to be the people that we spend our time with for the most part. Um, and but we have to recognize, and then we feel with any object of attachment, we feel like there's a threat to our sense of contentment, our sense of ease, our sense of peace, if we are separated from objects of attachment. And people are just as valid as of objects of attachment as are inanimate objects of attachment. An object here just means that which can be cognized. So we can relate to a car through attachment, and we can relate to a person in our family or a friend or a loved one through the energy of attachment in exactly the same way. And we might, in exactly the same way, feel distress um, during the time of death, recognizing that that interaction is no longer possible, that we will no longer be able to benefit from being around what we find enjoyable or pleasant about that person, their whatever it is that we value, enjoy, find useful about them. We will be separated from. And of course, this plays into not knowing what comes next and so on. So there's a lot of fear and anxiety that can arise in the same way. Um, so he says that grasping at these relationships is a great hindrance to our practice. He says that so meeting always leads to separation. So, this is something, the way in which we work with this from a practice standpoint is to understand that when things come together, they will dissolve, and that it cannot be otherwise. That either we will die first, they will die first, or we will grow apart. We have all known many people who we thought we'd be best friends with, or we would know forever, and then we grew apart from that person. We went we went to school with them, or we worked with them. We got a different job. We left school, or we moved, or they moved. We said, we'll stay in touch. And a couple of years went by and things changed and wasn't true in the same way. So even if that hasn't happened up through the death process, we have to recognize that at the time of death, that will be what happens. So there is no option for the coming together of a relationship apart from the falling apart, the dissolution of that relationship. Just like there's no option for the coming together of the body and mind in the womb, except for the dissolution of body and mind at death, and the coming together. So this is one way of working with the energy of attachment in general that we can apply in a generalized way when we think about anything that we're attached to, whether it is a person or whether it is an object. The nature of that object is also to fall apart. The nature of that car, the nature of that, whatever it is, it can only end in separation, either because it breaks, it ceases to function, or we lose it, either just because we misplace it or because we ourselves are no longer able to relate to it because of our death. So when any two things come together, they will be separated, whether it's body and mind, or person and person, or person and object. No two comings together persist indefinitely. They're always transitory. They are always temporary. And so again, that's not what we have to think about. Is that true? Is that something that the Buddha is saying that doesn't reflect reality, or is the Buddha just pointing out something that's valid about reality? And if it's valid about reality, do we grasp in a different way? Do we hold in the mind something other than what's valid about reality? And does that cause suffering? If we grasp at things at a way in which they cannot exist, is that the cause of suffering or not? And if we're grasping at something at a way, in a way that's other than how it can be, can we then adopt over time, with effort, with training, adopt a different way of relating to it, a more valid, a more realistic way of relating? And if we can, would we suffer less when the time comes to be confronted with that aspect of reality? Yeah. Any thoughts or questions about the contemplation on relationships? Yep.
So it's stated in terms of negation, like what we should not do. But what would it mean then to have the proper relationship of connection?
So I think it's because he also talks about how even within a lifetime, we can't be certain of our relationships. We can't, you know. So what he doesn't specifically here, this particular contemplation is through the lens of the transitory nature of relationships. So that's the particular antidote that he's giving us. There are others, but here he's trying to help us to see that we grasp at the relationship that's arising in that moment as if it's permanent. And that's not valid. That's not true. And so, because we've all had relationships with friends who became strangers, friends who even became enemies. And we've also had relationships with strangers who have become friends, and even enemies that have become friends. People that we really didn't like, but then we recognized, I misunderstood this quirk that they had, or I thought they didn't like me, and maybe I realized, they were just kind of a nervous person, or they're a shy person, and I misunderstood their facial expressions and then they're like, oh yeah, they're just kind of like that. But they actually have all of these good qualities, and we got to know those good qualities, and then we were like, I can kind of look past the fact that they have these idiosyncrasies that I misunderstood or misinterpreted. So we've all had all of those experiences, and that's the particular lens that's being introduced here, is to understand that in our minds, from our side, when we're in a relationship, we relate to it with no recognition of its transitory nature. And so the antidote is to again and again reflect on all of the ways in which relationships do inevitably change. They do, even over the course of this life. And then that doesn't mean that we don't relate to loved ones as loved ones. And, um, at the time, that we cut off people, like if we get a diagnosis or we think, it doesn't mean that we stop caring about our loved ones and so on. But it just means that we understand that death, even for the relationships that we have at that time, that are very close, that are very loving, that are very beneficial, the death itself will be what transitions that, will be what cuts that off. And so getting comfortable with that kind of groundlessness, that uncertainty, that we can express care, we can express loving kindness, we can express gratitude, and all of those things day by day by day for the people in our orbit, without grasping at a sense of permanence, without grasping at a neediness for that to always be what's happening, because we will be separated, even if it's only because of the arising of our own death. And then the other strategy that's not directly brought up here is, again, to go back to that distinction between love and attachment, and to try to recognize, how am I relating to this person? Am I relating to them through the lens of needing them to make me happy, to make me comfortable, to put me at ease? Or am I relating to them through the lens of wanting them to be happy, wanting them to have the karmic causes and conditions for happiness? And the more that we relate to people through pure love rather than through the lens of attachment, the less problematic that relationship will naturally be at the time of death. Any questions on relationships? Nope. All right. So Geshe Zopa is teaching here at 7. So we may want to wrap today's class up a little bit early, because we may need to do some work here to get ready for that. So I apologize normally, because we had to move that. So normally that doesn't happen. Although maybe when we may have to think about, in a few months, we may have the DB program here, or the BP program here in person for some time. So we may have to think about maybe ending at 6:20 rather than, anyway, doesn't matter. But for today, we'll go ahead and wrap up a little early. If there are no final questions. All right. So we'll recollect our motivation and think that by having listened and participated in the class, we've actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind, which we have a sense of letting go of, offering the fruit of our practice for the benefit of countless sentient beings. So just on your own, think of all of the vast, incredibly beneficial ways in which your positive energy will ripen. All right. I will see everyone again on Monday.